the visual of a sombrero. And the sombrero, obviously, I think most of us have an idea of what a sombrero looks like in terms of its structure. You have a high point in the center, and then it basically falls down around that center point on all sides. And so you can imagine that supersymmetry state, or that highly symmetric state, being the top of the sombrero, the very pinnacle of this sombrero. And imagine putting a ball on top of that sombrero. Well, what's going to happen? That ball is going to perhaps stay balanced for a very short period of time, but eventually you're going to have a spontaneous symmetry breakage, quote unquote, and the ball will roll down into the bottom of the sombrero, and it will come to rest somewhere in the brim of the hat, so to speak. And so that is also, you can kind of look at that as moving from a state of high potential energy to a state of low potential energy, from a state in which that energy was, there's a very delicate symmetry to which it was a fairly robust condition at the bottom. Obviously, the ball can move around the bottom of the sombrero, it can move around the brim of the hat, but it's not necessarily going to just spontaneously roll back up the hill, whereas it can very easily spontaneously roll down the hill. So once you look at everything through that lens, then you not only don't necessarily have to do the work of interpreting reality in real time, you also have a built-in community. Down at the bottom of the sombrero, you have a little tribe. And that's also another part of this model that's quite interesting, which is at the bottom of the sombrero, you have different tribes who have fallen off the perceptive peak, if you will, into these lower energy states, or these lower energy interpretive frameworks. And they resist one another as well. You could kind of think of them as having magnetic forces, and in the same way that magnets can either attract or repel, certain aspects of the low energy consolidation ideologies will attract or repel one another. And so you can imagine that over time, what would happen if you basically take the sombrero that's like this and flip it towards you. So now we have a circle right here, and you can see the circle. And so you have all these different ideologies who have fallen to the bottom of the sombrero into a circle. If you look at what's going to happen there, if you factor in the repulsive and attractive dynamics that are going on, you're going to start to see sorting technologies or sorting patterns, some of these self-sorting behavior, if you will, and these different ideologies will start to cluster. And as they start to cluster, they'll probably cluster along their primary, most strongly interpretive dimensions. And at that moment, when these ideologies cluster around their more strongly interpretive elements, what emerges from that dynamic is most likely going to be something that is a far lower number of parties over time. So you'll get clustering around something like the left-right divide. And the left-right divide does seem to map at a very fundamental level upon this order and chaos dichotomy. And you have the right, who is this basically, and I hate to use this terminology because I fundamentally believe that we need to move away from this terminology of left and right. But over time, what we do see is a eventual mapping of all of these different perspectives, all these different low energy perspectives shift over time, realign, create alliances, engage in conflicts, and sort themselves out into a structure that conforms to perhaps what is the primary underlying dimension of complex adaptive systems, which is this tension between whatever the individual agent at a given layer of the system happens to be, and the emergent structure of the collective and the needs of the collective that form around them. And so you therefore effectively regress to this one-dimensional spectrum, this one-dimensional tension. So we've had two steps at this point. We first started in a symmetric state of high energy, where you're able to have an open frame to all new information without applying any a priori ideology, which is a very difficult position to maintain, especially in perpetuity, and also perhaps not as adaptive because A, you're spending a lot of energy, and B, You are also not really encoding that information that you're taking into an interpretive framework whatsoever. You're kind of trying to stay on the edge of potential perception. We've gone from that position, we've fallen into this array of many different low energy hypotheses, is probably a good way of thinking about it. And over time, those low energy hypotheses that may have been sensitive to very specific dimensions of their unique experiences eventually cluster or polarize around the fundamental or primary dimension that drives the evolution of complex adaptive systems, which is this generative tension, or this tension between the individual constituents of any collective. And so there's a tension between the collective and at the higher order and the individual components that comprise the collective at the lower order. We are stuck. We're stuck in a place that feels increasingly untenable. We're stuck in a place that feels increasingly frustrating, that feels increasingly isolated, that feels increasingly psychotic almost, perhaps. We see stories that apply a frame to our reality that doesn't actually facilitate any growth, that doesn't actually facilitate that journey back up to the top of the hill, to the top of the sombrero. We don't treat those who come back from that position with useful information as heroes. We treat them most of the time as enemies, trying to undermine or invade our own political encampment, trying to break down our pre-existing belief structures. And we do not like that, because those belief structures are the things that shield us from the immense complexity of reality. And we have conversations not necessarily to get to the bottom of an issue or to really interpret a new perspective, but instead to display dominance, or to show how much we've read, or how much we know, or how well we've adapted, or how well we've mapped our lives to the ideas that the group around us believes are true, right? It's like, it's hard to go against the people around you. It's hard to say things that might be new, that might be needed, and yet might also isolate you from those you care about, and not even from those you care about. Beyond that, to say anything new in a world in which everything new is increasingly picked apart for any specific phrase that might be used to justify a pre-existing ideology, because whatever that ideology, whatever interpretive frame they hold as dear, or hold as their primary sombrero, modus operandi, their primary way of acting in the world, their primary structure for understanding and evaluating what is valuable, what is to be lauded, and what is to be hated. If anything that you say goes against that, or even not even goes against it explicitly in your own mind, but is even heard to contradict what these people are believing, or what they do believe, sombrero. And so the cycle, the merry-round goes round and round and round, and it's that is effectively this dynamic that we feel when we're kind of swirling the bottom of the sombrero. We're kind of in our polar opposite camps, rotating around each other at the bottom of this much larger structure, entrapped in this dynamic, and trying to break out. We're trying to break out every day with every, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us are trying to break out. Many of us see that it's insanity. I find myself coming back to this model and thinking that it is a really good way of thinking about why we've polarized and how we polarize, like from a very deep fundamental level, and using it as an interpretive frame to talk about why we need to go back to that center point, go back up that hill in a place that is difficult to stay. We probably don't necessarily want to stay there for very long, but we need to go back up to the top of the mountain, so to speak, and really rethink a lot of elements of our society. And we need better frameworks. We need better tools for understanding why it's not working. I think this is one of those tools. I think this Sombrero model allows us to understand that it's a dynamic process of going back up to the point of extreme exposure to the finer grained reality of our world, getting the data, gathering the new information, going to the city walls and looking out into the forest, exploring to understand what's going wrong from a perspective, from an open perspective, from a perspective that doesn't impose its a priori beliefs upon what it's seeing for the first time. Because if it's imposing its a priori beliefs upon whatever it's seeing, it's not going to be seeing them for the first time. That's fundamentally, this is kind of like the eyes of, seeing things through the eyes of a child. That's why we have terminology like that, because we understand that the process oftentimes of growing up is this process of falling down into these lower energy states in which we fall into patterns, we fall into habits, we fall into religions, we fall into communities that tell us how the world is, and they give us a story. And those stories are essential in many ways for us to interpret reality, to interpret morality, to interpret value, to actually lay over the landscape of potential some sort of grid of understanding that you can actually walk upon, that's actually treadable, that doesn't just give way to a sea of chaos immediately when you step on it. But that being said, there are times when we need to melt the ice. There are times when the structures have become so rigid, have become so polarized. And not only polarized, but then also the polarization has become monetized and therefore locked in. There are these times when we need to understand that the fundamental necessity of our age, of our time, is to reascend those peaks, to climb back up to the top of this perceptual sombrero, if you will, and to look back out over the landscape and to come back with new ideas, new modes of thought. And the whole point of all these conversations is to go back up to that top of the sombrero. Like, we're having conversations that are at this singularity of symmetry, at this point of coherence, trying to seek a place in which new information can shine forth through conversation and make its way back into the stuck and overly structured, polarized landscape of the left and right, and perhaps explode those paradigms a little bit, perhaps dissolve their constraining or constricting exoskeletons and unleash the potential of all of the individuals who are now trapped within them, who are now bound to these ideas, these political religions, and find the seeds, find the information that can unlock, find the keys that can unlock those chains, if you will, the structures that have either metastasized or crystallized around people's perception, around people's ability to see the world for the first time, to see the world again with new eyes, because the world is changing, the world is constantly updating, constantly shifting under our feet. And if you bound yourself to the Democratic Party, or if you bound yourself to the Republican Party, or if you bound yourself to libertarian ideology, or if you've already bound yourself to this crypto decentralization world, if you've bound yourself to that, if you've dug your feet in and you're no longer willing to interpret reality through any other frame, then you might as well be in prison. You might as well be chained to a particular perspective. And that seems to be inadequate. It seems to, in our world of increasing complexity, in a world where the majority of our problems are becoming global problems, in a world where we are all fundamentally connected at the speed of light, even though we still speak different languages and have different cultures and have different perspectives, being chained to an interpretive framework, being chained to one position, being chained to one lens into reality is just not going to work. There's absolutely no way that inflexible, that low dimensional of a representation can possibly hope to perceive, interpret, and act upon the world in a way that is up to the task, is up to the challenges set before us in this century. So